The Nigerian Naira lost 70% of its value in under 2 years. The Egyptian pound went through 3 devaluations in 18 months. Ghana defaulted. Zambia defaulted. Ethiopia defaulted. Sudan burned. Coups swept the Sahel, one government after another falling to men in fatigues. If you have read anything about Africa in the last 3 years, you have read some version of that list, and the conclusion always arrives on schedule. Africa is collapsing. The framing is so consistent that nobody questions it anymore. The poverty continent is doing what poverty continents do. And that is exactly why you should question it. Because I have lived and worked through every one of those crises from the inside, and I can tell you 2 things that never make it into the collapse coverage. The first is that most of those crises are not the same crisis, and half of them are actually signs of healing wearing the costume of disaster. The second is that while the headlines counted defaults, the flow of money, factories, and orders into the continent quietly hit records. Both of those things are true at once. So in this video, let me do what nobody covering Africa from a distance will do: separate the real collapses from the fake ones, name what is actually dying, and show you what is growing in the wreckage while everyone stares at the fire. I have spent more than 20 years operating businesses across this continent. I have wired money the week a currency broke, renegotiated contracts mid-coup, and watched my own costs double overnight and then fall back as the adjustment worked through. I am not going to tell you Africa is fine. I am going to tell you exactly which parts are broken, which parts are being deliberately broken on purpose, and which parts the collapse narrative cannot see at all. Start with the currency crises, because they are the loudest and the most misread. The Naira and the pound did not crash because those economies suddenly failed. They crashed because the government stopped lying about the exchange rate. For years, Nigeria and Egypt ran official rates that existed only on paper, a fictional price for the dollar that everyone with connections could access and resell, while every real importer paid the street rate plus a premium plus a bribe. The parallel market was not a glitch in the system. It was the system, a subsidy for insiders paid by everyone else. When the new Nigerian administration floated the currency, and Egypt finally let the pound find its level as the price of an IMF program, the official rate collapsed toward reality. The headlines called it a 70% collapse. The street, where every actual business already traded, had been living at that price for years. Nothing broke that morning except the illusion, and the arbitrage machine that fed on it. It was the most painful form of medicine, and it is still working through the system, but calling it collapse is like calling a fever reading collapse when the thermometer finally gets put in the right room. The defaults are the second category, and they deserve more sympathy and less panic. Ghana, Zambia, and Ethiopia did default on their foreign currency bonds after the easy money years of 2020 and 21 seduced them into borrowing dollars at rates that looked cheap until the Federal Reserve raised rates at the fastest pace in 4 decades. Every emerging market on Earth got hit by that same wave. What distinguishes the African defaults is not that they happened, but how they resolved, because unlike the debt crises of the 1980s, these restructurings actually completed. Zambia cut its debt, Ghana got a deal, Ethiopia crossed the line and kept negotiating. The system bent and did not shatter. The countries did not disappear from capital markets forever, and several have already returned to borrowing at single-digit yields, which is the market itself voting that the collapse story is exaggerated. A default is a bankruptcy, and bankruptcy, as anyone in business knows, is sometimes just the painful first page of a turnaround. It is worth comparing this cycle to the last one because the difference is the whole argument. When the debt crisis of the 1980s broke across Africa and Latin America, it took a lost decade to resolve, and the resolution, structural adjustment, arrived with austerity that hollowed out health systems and universities, while the debts were nursed along by banks that refused to write anything down. This cycle, for all the pain, moved faster and ended differently. Private bondholders took real haircuts, not because they were generous, but because the legal architecture of restructuring, collective action clauses written into the bonds themselves, forced them. China, the creditor everyone warned about, sat at the negotiating table instead of seizing ports. The International Monetary Fund programs came with social spending floors, a lesson learned from the 80s, protecting schools and clinics from the axe. The countries that defaulted in this cycle kept growing through their defaults, most of them, which would have been economically impossible in the 80s architecture. The machine for absorbing sovereign failure is simply better than it was, and that improvement is invisible in coverage that only counts the failures. The third category is the one I will not soften, because lying about it would insult the people living it. The Sahel is genuinely in trouble. 9 coups in the region in under 4 years, jihadist insurgencies that have displaced millions, and in Sudan a civil war that has produced the largest displacement crisis on the planet. Famine conditions for real, atrocities for real. This is a true collapse, driven by a toxic loop of climate pressure, jihadist spillover, French withdrawal, Russian opportunism, and governments that ruled by patronage until the patronage ran out. But notice what the collapse coverage does with it. Because the Sahel is maybe 15% of the population of Africa, and it is presented as the whole continent. Nobody covers a drought in Spain as the collapse of Europe. The Sahel deserves every minute of attention it gets, and it is a region in genuine agony, and it is not the story of 54 countries. Conflating them is not analysis. It is the oldest trick in the Africa coverage playbook, one crisis photo standing in for a continent. Now let me flip to the ledger nobody reads, the one I watch every week because it is my own money moving through it. While the collapse narrative peaked, foreign direct investment into Africa held near record highs, concentrated in exactly the sectors the future runs on. The Dangote refinery reached full capacity, the largest single train refinery on earth, and flipped Nigeria from fuel importer to fuel exporter. Morocco crossed toward 1 million vehicles a year, with the biggest car makers on earth expanding their plants. Chinese factories kept landing in industrial zones, over 1,000 of them now, because Chinese boardrooms did not read the collapse coverage, they read the demographics. A median age under 20 and a working age population that will supply most of the labor growth of the world for the rest of the century. Continental trade integration moved from treaty text to actual corridors, with trucks crossing borders under single customs documents, slowly, imperfectly, and more every quarter. The phones tell the same story from the bottom up. Smartphone penetration climbing, data costs falling, mobile money accounts now outnumbering bank accounts across most of the continent. Collapsing economies do not attract 1,000 factory migrations. Dying markets do not grow payment rails. The money is not confused. The money read the memo the headlines did not. The airlines are my favorite private proof, because airlines vote with routes and routes cannot be faked. Over the last few years, the major Gulf and European carriers kept adding African destinations while cutting elsewhere, and the African carriers themselves, Ethiopian above all, expanded into a genuine global hub network, connecting Shanghai to Lagos through Addis Ababa daily. Passenger numbers at African airports recovered past their pre-crisis marks, and the business traffic that fills the expensive seats, the traders, the procurement teams, the factory scouts, kept growing straight through the default years. There is no version of a collapsing continent where airline capacity to it expands, because a half-empty business cabin is the fastest route to a canceled route. Every week I sit in those cabins, and the mix I see, Chinese sourcing teams, Indian traders, Turkish contractors, American tech scouts, is the unedited leading indicator of where the continent is going, and it is not matching the news feed underneath it. So what is actually dying in Africa, if I had to name it in one sentence? The old post-colonial economic model is dying. The model where governments collected resource royalties and imported everything, where the state was the biggest employer, the currency was a political fiction, and the elite taxed the gap between the official and the real economy. That model is being killed by a combination of external pressure and internal revolt, and the killing looks exactly like collapse from the outside because every pillar of the old arrangement is a crisis when it falls. Floating the currency kills the arbitrage elite, and the funeral is a currency crisis. Auditing the debt kills the patronage machine, and the funeral is a default. Ending fuel subsidies kills the smuggler economy, and the funeral is a riot. Integrating the continent kills the border tax, and the funeral is a customs strike. You can mourn the instability because real people are paying real costs in every one of these transitions, and you should. But do not confuse the demolition with the building site, because on the same ground where each old pillar falls, something that actually works is being poured, and I have never seen a 2-decade transition this consistent in direction. The demographic floor under all of it is the part no collapse scenario ever prices. A continent of 1.5 billion people with a median age under 20 does not stop consuming because the currency moves, it adapts and substitutes, which is why African consumer markets kept expanding straight through the crisis years by every private sector survey. Young populations restart faster than old ones, because the engine of any economy is people entering their productive years, and Africa is producing more of them every year than the rest of the world combined will produce by mid-century. That is not a guarantee of success. Governance still decides whether the dividend becomes a boom or a time bomb, and I have seen both. But it is a guarantee against the terminal version of the collapse story, the one where the continent simply fails and stays failed, because the one input that story requires, a shrinking, aging, disillusioned population, is the single input Africa does not have. The 21st century ran out of young people everywhere, except here. Whatever else wobbles, that fact compounds quietly every single day, and it has been compounding through every crisis in this video. Now bring this down to your level. Because if collapse coverage has a cost, it lands on decisions like yours. If you discount African suppliers, markets, or partners because the continent reads as unstable, you are pricing a risk that mostly finished repricing and ignoring the risk that actually matters, which is timing. The currencies that broke have already found new levels, which means costs quoted today are real rather than fictional, and contracts signed now include none of the inflation of an upcoming adjustment. The countries that defaulted have already cleared the legal air, which is why the vulture funds are circling to buy in. The instability premium in African asset prices is, in my experienced view, wider than the actual instability, and that gap is where fortunes on this continent have been made in every cycle since independence. I am not telling you to close your eyes and buy. I am telling you that the fear is systematically overpriced because it is priced by people reading headlines from 40,000 feet, and the correction to that price is a matter of when, not if. Because in the end, the collapse story about Africa is the same story that was told about Asia in 1997, and about Europe in 2012, and about every region that has ever passed through a debt cycle while growing. The crises were real. The obituaries were wrong. The Asia that survived its crash built the wealthiest generation of companies in history, and the Europe that survived its debt spiral is still standing while its doom authors retired undefeated and uncorrected. Africa is mid-transition, further along than the headlines admit, and earlier than the optimists wish, with real fires burning in the Sahel and real buildings rising nearly everywhere else. The continent is not collapsing. The old arrangement is collapsing, and the difference between those two sentences is worth about $1 trillion over the next decade to whoever understands it first. If you are watching the transition from inside your own industry, tell me in the comments what is dying and what is rising where you sit. I read every one. Subscribe if you want the view from the ground instead of the view from the newsroom. See you in the next video.